Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to the Analysis.News, a special interview session today with Daniel Ellsberg and Noam Chomsky. Be back in just a few seconds. Please don't forget the donate button. We can't do this without you. And be right back. Once again, joining me is Daniel Ellsberg and Noam Chomsky. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I've asked Noam and Dan if they would actually kind of interview each other, and I'll jump in if I need to. But at any rate, Noam's going to go first and ask Dan a question. So go ahead, Noam.
Okay. Actually, I can ask quite a lot of questions. There's lots of things I'd like to hear your take on, which I have a limited grasp of. One of them that's kind of in the forefront now, I think, is or should be, there's a good deal of increasingly open talk in Washington, British analysts, others, about the fact that the United States is getting a kind of a bargain out of the Ukraine war, quite apart from military industry, fossil fuel industry, Europe falling into Washington's pocket. The United States has a number of military figures, and others have pointed out, is able to significantly degrade the military capacity of its main military enemy at a very small cost to itself, and can therefore husband its resources for the major war that it's planning with China. I'm just wondering what your take is on all of this.
Noam, as mine know from inside, it's very profitable to prepare for war, to plan for war, but above reduce for war. For instance, I have it all that arms manufacturers would like very much to break through the limits on war material that we provide to Taiwan that have been in place since about 79, when Carter actually recognized Beijing as the capital and there being one China. And Congress forced on that agreement, a separate agreement, that Congress would continue to budget for, and we would continue to sell military arms to Taiwan. You're talking about China now. Despite the fact that Carter just recognized Taiwan as a province of China, as virtually all Chinese regard it. And until this century, nearly all Taiwanese regarded it as a province of China. Now there is an independence movement which has grew up just at the end of the last century and earlier, and since then. But generally, they've regarded it as part of China. So we have this kind of paradox of sending weapons to a province of China. We don't send them to any other province of China, Xinjiang, for example, and we don't do that. But this moves toward seeing Taiwan as a separate part, which, of course, it is by about 100 miles. And but it's actually as contradicting the idea of one China. However, Congress insisted we be able to send, but with a limit, defensive arms and not excessive amounts. And I can't help but believe that there are a lot of people who would like to break through that. They have been increasing the amount, of course, over the years, and even more in the last year. And of course, we've been taking a lot of moves like Nancy Pelosi and even progressives like Ro Khanna to make visits to Taiwan of a kind that didn't occur before, and which are in the line of recognizing Taiwan as a separate, independent and sovereign country. Now, why? What's the pressure for that? And I certainly am not an expert on that area, but I think one contributor, just one, but not an insignificant one, is the desire to enormously increase the sales of arms that we make to Taiwan. No ceiling on that. If it is recognized as an independent country, which we're moving toward with these open statements of commitment to defend them from China, then of course an independent country can make alliances. That's sovereignty. In fact, all of Latin America is our sphere of influence in which countries have limited sovereignty. They cannot make alliances with, quote, foreign powers. We're not a foreign power, of course, in the Western Hemisphere. And they can't have bases, for example. If they were totally sovereign, they could. But we were preparing to invade Cuba even before Russia, in response to those plans after the Bay of Pigs in 61 and 62, were providing arms, and not yet nuclear arms. But there were great calls, pressing calls for Kennedy to announce an invasion of Cuba, going right up to the moment when actually they turned up with nuclear weapons from Russia. Now, I come back, they have no legal status, as they don't, clearly. The position we take is no, sovereign countries, independence, separately. What Kennedy's preparing for and was preparing for, and all accelerated it when the buildup appeared, totally aggression, was illegal. We regard it as criminal and illegal for China to claim that it has a right to have to determine the nature of the government and to claim Taiwan as its own. But we come back to the question, which I don't fully answer. I'll come back to Noam. Aside from the desire to have, I think, Taiwan not only as a purchaser of our weapons, a great profit to our arms sales, but as a base, again, as it used to be before 79. They used to have nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons in Taiwan. I visited bases with nuclear weapons in Taiwan in 1960. And thereafter, I don't think the Navy has ever fully reconciled itself to losing Taiwan as a base. And with all this talk about containing China with a circle of, quote, friendly powers, a NATO-like encirclement of China, as we did with Russia, I think Taiwan would be a marvelous part of that circle of containment. It would be just wonderful to contain China from these various things, including parts of China that they read as Chinese. Turn the question back to you.
I'm wondering what this conception that's now spreading high circles, that we can degrade Russia on the cheap by losing Ukrainian lives to degrade the Russian forces, and we can kind of control it enough so that it doesn't lead to the strong Russian response. So we'll just keep it under control. At the same time, preparing for a massive assault on China. And I'm just wondering, for example, recently there were reports about the Marines shifting their tactics to from heavy armaments to island hopping, go back to Iwo Jima and so on. I mean, can they really seriously be thinking that we can be preparing for a war with China where the Marines will be attacking islands as in the Second World War, and it's not going to blow up into a total catastrophe?
I don't believe they're preparing to invade Taiwan. I think it would have to be with the request or politicians who indeed may have been induced in various ways to make that request, bribed or impelled in some ways. But I think what they do not, I cannot believe they have in mind an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. They do intend, like the puppets. Yeah. Hmm? Do you really believe that? I think the idea would be that, like our puppet government in Saigon, asking us, and they asked us in sometimes after the Marines had arrived. Fan Hui Quat, I know very well, the Prime Minister, I know very well a fact that Fan Hui Quat, whom I did meet but didn't know well, was not informed that Marines were about to land in Da Nang in 1964. But of course, he endorsed it once it happened. And the rest of the involvement there did have the appearance of asking a request of a government that we describe sovereign, although we had created South Vietnam. The U.S. created South Korea. South Vietnam had not existed before. We drew a line particularly. Taiwan, as I say, went back and forth and so forth. But for many years, we treated it as an American base. And we didn't do that by invading it. We had people there who relied on it and profited from it, wanted us to support Chiang Kai-shek's pretensions that his claim to being the ruler of all China, the Democrat, was based on his firm intention to reinvade China. And we supported operations against China from Taiwan and from the offshore islands, some of them a mile and a half from China. And when China was opposing those, they were opposing bases that we were using for covert operations. How to keep them in U.S., that is, Chiang Kai-shek's hands? And the answer was, there's only one way to do that. They're a mile and a half, some of them, a few more, within sight of mainland China. Only nuclear weapons can keep them away. And so Eisenhower was prepared to initiate nuclear war to maintain islands that are just within sight of the mainland, as part of the defense of Taiwan, which we regarded in effect as a subordinate. So 65 years ago, it was still top secret that Eisenhower had been ready, if necessary, to hold those islands, to initiate nuclear war, with the understanding in his eyes that although China didn't have nuclear weapons, read Ukraine, its allies and a supplier, Russia, did have nuclear weapons, and Eisenhower expected a response from the U.S. against Taiwan and Shanghai, and possibly bases in Japan and Guam that were supporting this effort. In other words, to which our response would be all-out war, which, as I found in 61, the Joint Chiefs expected to kill 600 million people. They didn't know then in 1958 or 61. They didn't know until 1983, when nuclear winter became conceptualized and predicted by many scientists, and it was confirmed by today, that it wouldn't be just 600 million that would be killed. We expected to attack, we planned to attack, we targeted every city in Russia over 100,000, and 80% of the cities over 25,000, and the same in China. That's where you get up to 600 million in fallout from those attacks. But what we didn't figure then was that the smoke from the burning cities would be lofted by nuclear attacks. Hard to do this with non-nuclear attacks, but possible. We did it in Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo, created firestorms that lofted the smoke into the stratosphere where it wouldn't burn out. But that was only 3 cities. With 100 to 200 cities of that smoke in the atmosphere, and you get that firestorm every time with nuclear weapons, then it blocks the sunlight, 70% of the sunlight for years, up to a decade. It kills all harvests, and it starves nearly everyone to death. Not everyone. Some Argentina, Alan Rose having dinner with us tonight, actually, leading environmental scientists. 90 to 98% starved to death in a year. He has a big peer-reviewed study that says it will be over 5 billion. He was telling me it'll be a lot more than that. So that's what, I'm bringing this up to today. That's what we're facing now, with a prospect of continuing this war, including moving toward the invasion of Crimea and the full expulsion of all Russians from the Donbass, where Russian troops have been for 8 years now. They've all got to go. Putin has said he is prepared to use nuclear weapons to prevent that Crimea, for example, is a trigger if he's really facing expulsion, which he wouldn't be, in my opinion, from Ukrainians alone. But if some people, including many major factors in Ukraine, including Zelensky, someone, want and get direct U.S. involvement, on this, and not just a matter of arms sales and provisions, but troops and pilots, not just F-16. Then Putin would be seeing a real challenge in Crimea as well, and Donbass. And I think not bluffing. He could be. People have bluffed in the past, and they've not bluffed in the past. And I don't think he's bluffing. Now, I am getting away from your point that there are people who don't want to press it to that point because they want war with China, which is a nuclear power, of course. And actually, China doesn't have the number of weapons that the Russians do. And China doesn't need a first-use threat like Putin in its own region. For 20 years, since Clinton sent carriers in the Taiwan Straits as a challenge to them when they were testing missiles in the area of Taiwan, we sent 2 carriers in them. The Chinese have been building up their conventional capabilities, including anti-aircraft carrier cruise missiles and a lot of airfields and other things, so that U.S. can't do that again. And they will control that. It's pretty well recognized that they have at least conventional parity there, if not superiority. That's the difference from Europe. That used to be the way it was in Europe. We thought there was an overwhelming conventional superiority of Russian Soviet troops against West Europe. Now, that was always hyped up, a hoax, but there was a basis for that supposedly rationalized the idea that we would initiate more, the basis of NATO planning. We don't have to do that anymore in Europe. Why is Putin doing it? Because he's in the position we used to do. He's imitating our old policy. He has a conventional inferiority in Europe. So he's doing what we did for 70 years, threatening initiation for world war and blowing the world up. It has no more justification than we had for 70 years, and we're still making it. And here's the point I was leading up to your question. President Biden could easily, actually has said in 2016, when he was just leaving office as vice president, he couldn't think of any circumstances in which it would be to the benefit to initiate nuclear war or to threaten it. That was Vice President Biden in 2016. He ran on that in 2020. No first use. We will not initiate nuclear war, which seems, sort of a bedrock of sanity, except for the fact that we have been saying the opposite for 70 years. But here we had a presidential candidate who was at last recognizing that it would be immoral and insane to initiate nuclear war anyway. Well, he's been in office 2 years. He hasn't said that. He's not going to say it. He could very well afford to say that so that he could say Putin's threats are now unjustified, totally immoral as they are, and with no longer saying, and we're saying the same. Hard for us to say that now because that is NATO policy right now, what he's threatening. And he won't say that, I think, because many Americans feel he will need that threat in Taiwan, that to hold on to Taiwan as an independent state, in effect, which we haven't openly recognized, but saying that we'll defend them, it goes pretty far. We can't assure a conventional defense. We could actually defend it with non-nuclear weapons. But if Biden says no nuclear weapon first use threat for Taiwan, he will be accused by political factors and authoritative people saying, you are right now inviting a Chinese invasion into Taiwan. And that goes along with our ideology and our commitments of the last 50 years, very openly till 79. And after 79, as we move toward treating Taiwan as an independent to which we are in effect allied, we're back to threatening it. So in short, we need Putin's threat for Taiwan, even not in Europe. And that is what makes me a little pessimistic, that without pressure, Biden will not do what he would be, I think, quite willing to do in Europe.
Well, based on your incomparable experience with these guys, is it conceivable in your view that they are now thinking, the gang around Biden, that they can calibrate the war in Ukraine carefully enough so as to keep degrading Russia, sacrificing Ukrainians, not lead to a Putin escalation of the war, and at the same time prepare the Marines, your old friends, to start island hopping in a planned war against China, which they will somehow be able to calibrate as well to keep it short of Chinese nuclear weapons and gain the goal of degrading China as well. Can it be that they're really thinking of that?
The Marines, as I understand it, moved to the training in recent years for amphibious operations, which were the essence of my 3 years in the Marines, as a platoon leader and then company commander, but as a battalion planning officer, assistant battalion planning officer. It's all for amphibious operations. But now, gradually much more helicopters instead of landing craft. I probably went down the nets from the ship, a rather challenging project, actually, when you have a big pack on your back and weapons, and more than 100 times, and practice it all the time. So, and of course, based on the island hopping of World War II. Yes, they've been rehearsing now for helicopters for a long time. So I don't think they've been, but they do, as you say, seem to be moving back. I don't know the details on this, but they are moving back toward more operations like that in their training. Now, something that occurs to me, which my memory isn't too precise on, but hasn't China been very much warming their relationships with the Solomon Islands? Isn't that where Guadalcanal was? My first brother-in-law died in 19, the Battle of the Tenero in Guadalcanal. Well, before, they can go back to that, I guess. And then we have the islands that the Chinese have built up in the South China Sea to some extent, for airstrips and so forth. Yeah, you could take over those. But I do think, by the way, coming back to the first part of your question initially and now, the attitude on Europe. What do they plan there? It's true. They're, especially Republicans, seem to be sounding almost sane in direction on Ukraine in the sense of not an indefinite amount of escalation here, not forever, not forever. You even have what to say. How shall I describe Marjorie Taylor Greene? A maniac saying it would be insane to invade Crimea. Well, that's true. And you have Democrats who are denying that and going along with Zelensky's pronounce we're going to invade Crimea. So the Taylor Greene things I have used, but I'm afraid not good even for a joke, but I have used instead. I do have a principle. Can't count on, you might think you could use as a compass point somebody who is always wrong. Lindsey Graham offers himself for that, for instance. And one would think Marjorie Taylor Greene, but I've often said you can't count on anyone to be wrong on everything all the time. And as I mentioned that, somebody even said to me, friend, even Lindsey Graham had a good resolution on immigration the other day. So maybe I've been misjudging him. That means you just can't set your compass cord opposite to these people pretty reliably though. So in Europe, I think that the Democratic leaders that are, like Blinken, Austin, Sullivan, and Biden, have shown a willingness and even a desire for the war in Ukraine to continue indefinitely at this level and somewhat higher. I don't think they want, I'm pretty sure they don't want nuclear war. But it's like, as Condoleezza Rice says, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. Well, how do you know you've gone enough by oppressing the Russians and too much? And you know it when this mushroom cloud comes up. Oops, we're far. And Crimea offers itself as abyss. I don't think they want a two-sided nuclear war or even a one-sided one in Europe. They are threatening a one-sided war in Taiwan, and I think they'll continue to do that. Putin is threatening what he hopes, I believe, is a one-sided war to hold on to Crimea, where virtually all Russians, I understand, do regard that as part of Russia, the existential threat to lose it and so forth. And he has a lot of support for that. But Donbass, is more of a complicated issue. Will he really blow up the world to keep all of his troops in the Donbass as opposed to going back to pre-2023 and 2022, February 24th? We don't know. But as Noam, as you keep pointing out in other channels, it's outrageous that there is no negotiation going on this point, to be no communication. The fact that Blinken's and Lavrov's foreign ministers' first discussion since the war began was 10 minutes a day at a conference, which Blinken used to say, get all your troops, withdraw out, in effect, withdraw from the Crimea. That's not going to happen. But a nuclear war, I think he knows that. We can just say no communication. Well, that's outrageous in terms of the interests of the world. But I think to keep it going, there's nothing but benefit for the ruling circles in this country. The profit to the military-industrial complex, the share profits of Lockheed, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing have gone up, as have the profits of the oil companies. And I would say they're not going down. But even more important, as you said, for the arms sales aspects, is the fact that NATO is back, having appeared to have no purpose, no rationale since about 1992, with the end of the USSR, the end of the Warsaw Pact moving, and not existing as a Russian set of satellites. It seemed to have no purpose of NATO. And now Putin back as an enemy. It's a unifying factor for NATO with the US at its head. I have to say, we've taken on, and with a lot consensus, the role of a military protector in Europe, a protectorate, first in West Europe, now in East Europe. Now, it's hard to get the benefits of being a protector, a protection racket, unless you're protecting them against somebody. And I think that Kennan's and Gorbachev's desire for a peaceful, democratic Russia to be part of a peaceful, democratic Europe community, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, but anyway, from Lisbon, very wide European community, that was not desired. Kennan said, you won't get this if you go into Ukraine. Matlock, Burns, others said, many psychologists said, you can't have a peaceful democratic Russia if you talk about going into Ukraine. And if you get Ukraine in NATO, you will have very bad relations with Russia. And I think that was heard by other people in Canada. Aha, that gives us our roadmap. We'll do everything we can to get Putin, in this sense, to look like an enemy and to do things that make enemy appear, that's a trap he fell into. And so we have Putin back. That's full. We have all the benefits now of being a protector of Europe against, and it is indeed committing aggression, massacring people, and in every way encouraging people F-35s. He's the greatest salesman for this dog of a plane, F-35, which is in the shop all the time and cannot fly near a thunderstorm because it doesn't have good lightning protection. And all the other competitors for fighter bombers, and Saab Gripen and Dassault and others, Rafael, they're all out. It's F-35s all over. Well, that's okay with Lockheed. They've been lobbying for that since the 90s. So anyway, it's a perfect little war, as they used to say, the Spanish-American War. In this case, can't go on too long, but with the constant risk of inciting Putin to carry out threats of the kind we have often made, but haven't yet been carried out.
Well, actually, Lindsey Graham, who you mentioned, is one of those who's been celebrating the fact that the U.S. is degrading the Russian military with very little expense to ourselves, a great deal of expense to Ukraine and the rest of the world. But notice what's happening. NATO is now at its last summit an Indo-Pacific power. We have now been able to enlist Europe in the planned confrontation with China, which is pretty much bipartisan agreement, is the main conflict. We'll sort of somehow calibrate things so that it doesn't get out of hand in Europe. We'll fight to the last Ukrainian, as some are putting it. But meanwhile, we'll prepare for China, where U.S. has now sent, it's not only the shift in the marine strategy, which I mentioned, the U.S. now has, for the first time, established permanent bases for B-52s in Darwin, Australia, in Guam, maybe pretty soon in the Philippines. They're now building up again the military connections with the Philippines that had declined, and it looks as though they seriously think that they can somehow continue to provoke China, also with the commercial war, which is trying to prevent China from any technological and economic development, maybe bring them to their knees. Can they really, I mean, judging by what you've seen on the inside, can anybody be crazy enough to really be thinking this?
I haven't been on the inside for about the time, since about I got to know you and read your books and be influenced by you. So I'm not on the inside. In fact, I want to ask you, and I'll tell you what, I want to ask you, what is your opinion here? By the way, your book was about American power and the new mandarins. I'm just looking at it. I'll tell you why in a minute. But of course, that looked at the Pacific War in World War II in a way that totally changed my understanding of it as somebody who'd grown up slightly from 10 to 14 during World War II. And it certainly changed my attitude. So why they do seem to be acting that way. Not all of them, but not every politician, but most of them actually, and more Democrats than Republicans, and certainly in Europe, but also on the Pacific. Why? I don't know. I'll tell you right away, as an outsider, I don't know why they are acting as if they want war with China. You tell me.